You can start history any place. We can go back to the Ice Ages, the Egyptians, Sumerians, the Hebrew Bible, um, Roman Republic, I don't care, and start the story in place. I think the place where you can get a nice unbroken chain of things, maybe not all the links are the same size, though, is with the start of the Germanic Kingdoms. And the Germanic Kingdoms emerged with the fall of the Roman Empire. And what happened was, and it's not often that you can sit there and put your finger right on a date of some process that begins, but December 31st, 406, the Germanic peoples, and people who spoke German, swept into the Roman Empire across the frozen Rhine River. They plunged through the Western Roman Empire. And the latest date you can have of the Western Roman Empire is 476. So that's a good date. Okay, 406 and 476, those are good dates. Yeah, probably did look something like that. The Rhine's a great big river at this point. It's well over a mile wide, actually several miles wide in some parts. And whether or not it looked like a wagon train, I don't have any idea. There weren't any photographs in, but this depiction, I think, is probably fairly accurate. And this is what that crossing looked like. And what emerged from this, as the Germans controlled what was the Western Roman Empire, is what you see here. A whole bunch of different kingdoms. And right here, for instance, traditionally there are 7 kingdoms in England. It's called the Heptarchy. Don't worry about spelling it. You can see all the little kingdoms over here in Ireland. Kingdom of the East Franks, and then Lotharingia, and then Kingdom of the West Franks over here. Kingdom of the Italians here, Kingdom of Burgundy right here, which of course is where you get Burgundy wine from. Down here, this is a Muslim. It's called an emirate, and they'll be called the Saracens later on in the in the literature. And then you've got all these little kingdoms here, and we can go into this. Over here is a large Muslim empire, possibly the largest empire of all time. But it doesn't really interact with this one here. But nevertheless, you can see that things are very much bits and pieces. And something interesting happened, and something which is going to create a whole new society, or at least 50% of a new society. You'll see why I say 50% in the next clip. What are the German kingdoms based on? Well, they were based on the idea of constitutionalism. Kings were believed to have had some type of divinity, and there were also a few queens too. We tend to forget that. But they had to recognize, regardless of how divine they were, they had to recognize that their people had rights. A king who did not recognize that their people had rights was not a divine king, and therefore not a legitimate king. Now decisions, at least governing decisions, belong to the king. The king could make any decision they wanted to. But before they did that, they couldn't do it just on their own. They had to take counsel. And so they had to call in the leaders of the kingdom, barons and dukes and bishops and people like that, and say, what do you think about this? Now, they didn't have to take their advice. The king, after all, is divine, and these other people aren't. But they did have to take counsel, or again, they weren't a divine king. And kings get into trouble for not taking counsel. They have to listen to the leaders of the kingdom. But kings could only go so far in terms of making decisions, and actually they couldn't go very far at all. And that's because of the concept of legal self-help. We still have that, the right to defend yourself, as an example. The king's authority was not broad. Most authority belonged to families or clans or tribes or things such like that. And so if, say, for instance, somebody killed your cousin, it wasn't the king's problem that a murder had been committed. It was the family's problem, your problem. And you had to go out, if you wanted to, and avenge your cousin. And so this oftentimes led to chains of murders that went on sometimes for as long as 50 or 60 years. But Neville and the king wouldn't intervene. It wasn't his problem, and he didn't have any authority to do so. We also see the emergence of primitive jury systems. Now, they may not have been jury systems that we would be particularly happy to be tried in front of, but they're recognizably jury systems, and they did decide things. In fact, they decided lots of things. Again, there were certain things they couldn't get into, but by and large, we can see toward the end of the 800s, beginning of 900s, we can see the emergence of recognizable jury systems. Again, they're not ones you would like, but they existed. There's an intense attachment to families, clans, tribes, locales. And then attachment ran two ways. If you belong to, say, a particular tribe, the law of the tribe attached to you. So you could have 6 people sitting at a table. And if each one of those 6 people came from a different tribe, they had a different law. And whoever was king over that particular place where the table was sitting had to recognize each one of those 6 laws. Now, that seems incredibly strange to us. We actually still do that to somewhat distinct, different people are treated differently depending upon where they come from. It's not anything like it was back then, but we still do that a little bit. And then there's the idea that old law is good law. A very important part of it. Otherwise, this class would be quite different. And the idea there is if the king is divine, the law that the king pronounces is divine. Therefore, if you come up with a new law that sets aside the old law, you're going against divinity. Makes sense, right? So the idea, therefore, was that if you want to find out what was divine, what was, what the god or gods wanted, you would go back and see how they did things in the past. And that leads us to the idea of precedent, both in England or the United Kingdom and in America, the United States. Old law, new laws are, not always welcome. But old laws, going back and finding a precedent, that's a good thing. There have been court cases in the United States that have been settled because attorneys have found a precedent back in the 1300s. So you would think something 700 years old might not be quite so good, but yeah, actually it is. And in fact, it's really good. Precedents are important in our system. So this is kind of the foundation of German governance. You have strong kings, but their range is small. Government is, such as it is very limited. The king can do what he wants to do, except for the fact that he has to take counsel. Laws are very ancient. At least you hope they're very ancient. And so this is the basis, not just of German society, but becomes the basis of Western civilization in one way, shape, form, or the other. Now, I don't know that this is maybe the most important thing I would put on tape, but you have butter instead of olive oil. Germans used butter. They didn't use olive oil. And almost nobody today goes into the movie theater, assuming that we ever have open movie theaters again, and pours olive oil over their popcorn. It just doesn't happen. Beer. Yes, I know people like to drink good wine, but on a hot day, you want a beer. You're sitting in a bar and you want a beer. And I'll make a bet that a lot more beer is drunk in college dormitories than, wine. Wood. People don't like marble homes, marble palaces. We have wood, a log cabin. People romanticize log cabins, and people like wooden homes. If you have beautiful wood in your home, it's a lot more impressive, believe it or not, than if you have a beautiful marble. We like rural, wild seashores, right? The sound of seagulls and all that. Forest, mountains. These are the kinds of things that Westerners like. And it comes from the fact that this is what Germans like. It's Western inheritance. And those who have joined Western civilization tend to like these things too. Hunting. About 1 out of 6, 1 out of 5 American adults are hunters or identify as hunters. They may not hunt very often, some do. But still, they identify that way. That's again part of your inheritance. No Roman would have identified as a great hunter. At least I can't think of any that would have been identified as a great hunter. There were a few Greeks who saw themselves as great hunters, but again, it wasn't part of Greek civilization. Hides, right? 40 years ago, mink coats. They were really important. But nowadays, hey, leather jackets. Don't you mess with my leather jacket, you know? And so hides tend to make up, again, an important part of our clothing in one way, shape, form, or another. Even if nowadays we use fake hides and plastic stuff and all that, it's still part of who we are and what we think of ourselves. So in any instance, that takes us through very quickly through the German kingdoms, but it lays for you the basis of what's going to happen later on, and frankly, it lays for you the basis of what we are today and who we are today and how our American society functions today. So I want everybody out there to stay healthy, and I hope that you're around for the next video. Take care.